In the 1990s, Madeleine Stowe was everywhere. From the sweeping romance and brutality of The Last of the Mohicans to the twisted time travel paranoia of 12 Monkeys, she was one of Hollywood's most magnetic leading women. Then, right as she seemed to be at the height of her power, she more or less vanished from the big screen. Today, we're going to look at her greatest performances, the choices she made, and why one of the biggest stars of the 90s decided to step away from it all. Let's fade to black. Madeleine Stowe came into the world in Los Angeles, and even her family history feels like something out of a movie. Her mother was from a well-known political family in Costa Rica. One of Madeleine's maternal great-great-grandfathers, Bruno Carranza, even served as president of the country. On her father's side, she had Dutch, German, and English roots, and he was originally from Oregon. Stowe grew up in Eagle Rock, a working-class neighborhood in Los Angeles, and as a kid, her first love wasn't acting at all. It was music. By the age of 10, she was seriously training to become a concert pianist, spending hours every single day at the keyboard. That was the plan, the dream, the future. But in 1976, everything changed. Her beloved piano teacher passed away. The loss was crushing, and it shook the foundation of her ambitions so deeply that she more or less abandoned the idea of a concert career. That devastating ending quietly opened the door to something else. Instead of pursuing the piano, she enrolled at the University of Southern California, where she studied cinema and journalism. Her interest shifted from playing music to understanding stories and images. In 1980, she popped up on television in an episode of Little House on the Prairie titled Portrait of Love, where she played Annie Crane, a blind painter. It was a small but striking role. She followed it with a handful of other TV and film appearances, yet none of them quite pushed her into the spotlight. At least, not yet. Then came 1987, and a little movie that would change everything, Stakeout. This action comedy paired Stowe with Richard Dreyfuss and Emilio Estevez as two cops assigned to keep a suspect's ex-girlfriend under surveillance. Naturally, both men end up falling for the same woman, Maria, played by Stowe. The film was a box office success, pulling in over $100 million worldwide, which was no small feat at the time. But more importantly, it proved something crucial. Madeleine Stowe wasn't just another pretty face on a poster. She was funny, charming, and had that intangible screen presence that made it impossible to look away. Stakeout was her real breakout, and the industry took notice. In 1989, she kept that momentum going. She appeared in the romantic comedy Worth Winning, playing Veronica Briscoe, an exacting intellectual and classical pianist opposite Mark Harmon's Playboy weatherman. That same year brought Revenge, a dark romantic thriller set in Mexico alongside Kevin Costner. These projects solidified her as a versatile leading actress who could swing from comedy to intense drama without missing a beat. The early 90s continued that streak. In 1990, she starred in The Two Jakes, the sequel to the legendary Chinatown, opposite Jack Nicholson. Stowe played Lillian Bodine in a tangled neo-noir about adultery, murder, and the oil industry in post-war Los Angeles. A year later, she took on one of her most challenging parts in Closet Land, an intense two-person psychological drama with Alan Rickman. She played a children's author accused of hiding subversive political messages in her books, trapped in an interrogation that feels almost surreal in its brutality and ambiguity. Around the same period, she appeared in Unlawful Entry, a psychological thriller that became one of the defining entries in the early 90s wave of paranoia-driven films. Stowe played Karen Carr, a woman who, alongside her husband Michael, played by Kurt Russell, experiences a home invasion that spirals into a nightmare they could never have imagined. The movie was another financial success, making roughly $57 million on a $23 million budget. What made it really click was the dynamic between the three leads, the uneasy, almost suffocating tension that kept audiences on edge. But the role that truly crystallized her movie star status came in 1992 with The Last of the Mohicans. Directed by Michael Mann and co-starring Daniel Day-Lewis, this was not just another period drama. It was a sweeping historical romance set during the French and Indian War in 1757, filled with lush landscapes, brutal battles, and aching emotion. Stowe played Cora Munro, the eldest daughter of a British colonel who falls in love with Hawkeye, a white man raised by the Mohicans. The film was visually stunning, emotionally charged, and a major critical and commercial hit. The chemistry between Stowe and Day-Lewis was electric. Their final moments together, when Hawkeye urges Cora to survive at all costs, promising he will come back for her, became one of the most unforgettable romantic scenes of 1990s cinema. That movie alone could have cemented her legacy. But she wasn't finished yet. In 1993, she joined the ensemble of Robert Altman's Short Cuts, an ambitious tapestry of interconnected stories set in Los Angeles. Surrounded by an incredible cast, Stowe held her own in a film that wasn't driven by a conventional plot so much as by mood, character, and the messy intersections of ordinary lives. It was a departure from her more mainstream thrillers and romances, and it proved she could dive into more experimental, character-driven material just as confidently. Then came 1994 and Blink, which gave her what was arguably her first truly central leading role in a major thriller. She played Emma Brodie, a blind Irish folk musician who regains partial sight after a corneal transplant, only to possibly witness a murder. Directed by Michael Apted and co-starring Aidan Quinn, the film revolved around a haunting concept. Emma experiences retroactive hallucinations, meaning her brain sometimes doesn't process what she's seen until hours or even days later. Roger Ebert called Blink an unusually strong thriller and praised Stowe for giving Emma an independent toughness instead of turning her into just another frightened victim. That same year, she also starred in China Moon, a sultry neo-noir in which she embodied the classic femme fatale opposite Ed Harris and Benicio del Toro. Set in a small Florida town, the movie was steeped in obsession, betrayal, and murder, drawing comparisons to earlier erotic thrillers like Body Heat. It was yet another example of how at home she seemed in morally murky, shadowy stories. And then in 1995 came 12 Monkeys. Directed by Terry Gilliam, this mind-bending sci-fi thriller really solidified her status as a major star. Stowe played Dr. Catherine Rayleigh, a psychiatrist pulled into the orbit of a disturbed man, Bruce Willis's time traveler, who claims he's been sent back to prevent a devastating plague. It's a role that required her to be skeptical, compassionate, terrified, and ultimately courageous, often in the same scene. She had to hold the screen not just opposite Willis, but also Brad Pitt at his most wild and kinetic, in a performance that would earn him an Oscar nomination. Many fans and critics still consider 12 Monkeys to be one of her finest hours. By the mid-1990s, Madeleine Stowe was no longer just a steadily working actor. She was a bona fide movie star. In 1995, Empire magazine named her one of the 100 sexiest stars in film history. Years later, in 2012, People magazine placed her at number 5 on their list of the world's most beautiful women. On paper, it looked like she had everything Hollywood promised: acclaim, visibility, and serious earning power. But behind the red carpets and glamorous photo shoots, Stowe was becoming increasingly uneasy with parts of her career, especially the nudity that was often expected of her. She later explained that no one ever held her career hostage over it. It wasn't a case of, do this or you don't get the role. She said she always agreed to those scenes willingly because they felt, at the time, somewhat inconsequential. As she grew older, though, that changed. It started to feel more personal, and she realized how much it underlined the idea that women were interchangeable, easily replaceable. That realization marked a turning point. She elaborated that while many of the people she worked with were wonderful, there was something deeply unsatisfying about repeatedly playing women who were essentially victims. At a certain point, she knew she couldn't keep doing it. It had to end. This was a woman who had every opportunity to keep landing substantial roles and big paychecks, and she was saying that the roles she was being offered were hollow at the core. Stowe talked about how what truly fascinated her was erratic behavior, the contradictions people carry, the strange ways we act under pressure. The world, she said, is so chaotic that she had found herself observing those inconsistencies more and more. And that highlighted one of the big problems with many women's roles. Female characters are rarely allowed to be messy, contradictory, or unpredictable. That kind of complexity is often reserved for male characters, who get to be flawed, difficult, and compelling. Women all too often get written as the girlfriend, the victim, the trophy at the end of the story, without a true arc of their own. While these frustrations were growing, something else had taken root in her life, something that mattered more than any script. In 1982, she married actor Brian Benben after about a year of dating. The two had met on the set of the NBC miniseries The Gangster Chronicles in 1981. In an industry famous for whirlwind romances, brief marriages, and brutal breakups, their relationship endured. More than 40 years later, they're still together. The couple didn't just settle into a Hollywood lifestyle. They bought and now run a working cattle ranch outside Fredericksburg, Texas. This isn't a vanity property or a weekend hideaway built for magazine spreads. It's an actual ranch that takes real work, early mornings, long days, and constant commitment. In 1996, they welcomed their daughter, May Theodora Benben, in San Antonio, Texas. Becoming a mother shifted Stowe's priorities in a way that the Hollywood machine was not built to handle. Suddenly, the idea of chasing one film after another, often far from home for months at a time, wasn't so appealing. So she did something that very few stars at her level ever do. She quietly backed away. There was no fiery op-ed, no explosive tell-all interview. She simply chose her family and her life in Texas over the relentless grind of the industry. After 12 Monkeys, she stepped back from acting in 1996 to focus on raising her daughter and being present with her family. When she returned in 1998, it was in the ensemble drama Playing by Heart, a romantic mosaic featuring an impressive cast that included Sean Connery, Angelina Jolie, Gillian Anderson, and Jon Stewart. Stowe played Gracie, a woman struggling with marital problems, bringing her understated emotional intelligence to a story about love in all its complicated forms. In 1999, she starred in The General's Daughter, a military thriller opposite John Travolta. Stowe played Sarah Sunhill, a rape investigator and Travolta's character's former lover, brought in to help solve the murder of a general's daughter. The film was another commercial success, bringing in close to $150 million worldwide. Yet despite that box office win, Stowe's on-screen appearances became more sporadic after this point. In 2002, she appeared in We Were Soldiers, a war film about the first major battle of the Vietnam War. She stepped into the role of Julie Moore after Faith Hill exited the project, portraying the wife of Mel Gibson's character and grounding the film's chaos in the emotional reality of the families left at home. But even as she continued to take on high-profile projects, it was increasingly clear that her heart was no longer entirely in the Hollywood race. Years later, she made a more extended return to the spotlight with the TV series Revenge, where she earned about $75,000 per episode between 2012 and 2013. It was one of the few times in her later career that she committed to a long-running project, and even then it was on terms that allowed her to spend more time closer to home. The contrast is striking. In 1994, she was paid $1.5 million for the Western Bad Girls. By any Hollywood metric, that meant she was operating near the peak of what she could command. She could have chosen to keep chasing that level of salary indefinitely. Instead, she chose a different path. What Madeleine Stowe seemed to understand, something many performers never quite grasp, is that fame and money aren't worth losing your sense of who you are. If you keep being asked to play characters that make you feel disposable, if you're not allowed to be interesting or contradictory or fully human on screen, if the work stops feeding your soul, what's the real payoff? At some point, the cost outweighs the reward. Stowe spent more than a decade in the inner circle of Hollywood, attending the metaphorical party, and then, almost without fanfare, she left. No meltdown, no scandal, just a quiet, deliberate exit. She saw what the industry was offering her at that time, recognized the limits it tried to place on her, and chose to step away rather than shrink herself to fit those constraints. Maybe the landscape is evolving now. Maybe today there are more layered, nuanced roles for women that go beyond the victim, the love interest, or the beautiful object. But in Stowe's heyday, she often found herself boxed in by how she looked and what others thought she should be. For the past couple of decades, she's largely lived a low-key life with her husband on their Texas ranch, far from the constant scrutiny of Hollywood. She stayed married to the same person for over 40 years, which in that industry is almost unheard of. The system is built to keep actors hungry, always hustling for the next gig, the next bigger paycheck, the next round of attention. Yet Stowe identified what actually mattered to her and had the courage to walk away from everything else. In a town built on ego, competition, and relentless ambition, that might be the bravest and most impressive performance she ever gave. Thank you so much for watching and for sticking with me through this story. If you enjoy this kind of deep dive into film history and forgotten careers, please consider hitting like, subscribing, and dropping a comment. It really does help the channel more than you might think. And as always, I genuinely look forward to seeing you all in the next one.